Hi guys, my name is Jeremy Lord. I am a freelance illustrator based in Sydney, and I'm doing a little video tutorial today to take you guys through some cool new tips in Photoshop using the Microsoft Surface Studio. The machine that we're working on is a Surface Studio. If you've got this really nice big screen, so this is 28 inches, it just means that you're not kind of constrained and have to, scratch away at a piece. You can really get in amongst the drawing as if it was a piece of paper. One of the really cool features about this as well is it can go from regular kind of desktop computer, it can go back into this what we call studio mode, where you can work at more like an artist table. So we'll get right into this. So we'll just delete that layer. We're looking at creating a digital piece, obviously, in Photoshop. And what that means is we're going to be working with layers, we're going to be working with different effects to create a digital illustration that will then be saved and outputted in a certain way. So what I like to do here is I would generally start with a digital sketch. You can start with an analog sketch, i.e. a sketch that's been done pen and paper, if you will, or pencil and paper, sort of ye old sketch kind of thing. But digital sketch is fine as well, because what this then does is, because I'm using my hands on this, it allows me to kind of rotate the canvas and zoom in and out exactly as if I was kind of holding a piece of paper on my desk. What we're going to be drawing today is this cyberpunk digital Japanese kind of peony that we've created beforehand. So obviously the first step is to create my basic drawing. That's where it all starts. This is the framework of what I'm about to create. What's really important here is that I'm happy with that sketch before I proceed further. It's a little bit like building a house, if you will. You wouldn't, start painting walls and hanging up pictures and choosing curtains and sheets and all that before you've made sure that the framework of your house is stable and safe and everything's working right. So we really want to get the basic construction of that drawing down right, and then we can move on and create some extra detail and get some color in there, which is exactly what we're going to do. I'm using a pen here, and this pen is going to allow me to literally draw straight onto that screen and work as a drawing tablet would. And what's really nice about this is that you get all these kind of different nibs to allow you to have a slightly different feel on this, which is nice because when you're working with pencil and paper, for instance, you do get a little bit of resistance from the grain of the paper. And it's not this kind of like ice skating rink that you can get sometimes when it's like, very hard plastic on glass. It can be very slippery and feel a little bit awkward to begin with. So what I would normally do then if I was kind of playing around with these nibs is I can literally just pull the nibs out of the pen, choose one of those and just pop it back into the pen and we're good to go. I'm going to use this guy. This guy is the dial or the wheel. He just pops onto the screen, and what happens is I can edit and customize different things that it will do. So if I have it on the rotate, I'm just kind of rotating it that way and it'll zoom in and zoom out. And it's a really kind of handy tool for me to have that basically acts as an extra sort of keyboard attachment for me not to have to reach over to my keyboard and use the shortcuts. It's all happening on here. So I'm going to program this guy to do something very specific for me, because by default it's got some sort of basic things like scroll, zoom, rotate, all those kind of things. What I want it to do is I want it to switch between the brush and the eraser. So I'm going to go into my settings and I'm going to go to devices and I'm going to go down to the wheel and then scroll down a little bit until we get to here. So I want to add an app to the wheel so that it behaves a certain way when I'm in that app, right? So I'm going to click add an app, and by default it finds me all the apps that can use the wheel, and Photoshop is top of that list, so that's good. And then I'm going to add in a tool. I don't want any kind of tool modifier. I just want that to be on my eraser. So when I'm rotating clockwise, it's going to go to my brush, and when I'm rotating counterclockwise, it's going to go to my eraser. One of them is set on B, the other one is set on E, and we're going to go to the click shortcut, and we're just going to go none and also none, and then we're done. So I can go back into Photoshop now, and if I sort of press this down onto the screen, you'll notice that there's a little one that's come up and it's been added to my wheel, and if I click on that, you'll see that it says B and E on the screen, and that's now my brush and eraser. So I would use this then to kind of create my sketch. I've got here, as you can see, the sketch that's already been made, but I'm just going to show you guys a few little kind of tips and tricks with the brushes and with the pen in order to create that. So I'm using a blue color here. I've got a foreground and a background color in Photoshop, but you can see I can kind of switch in between each two. Double click on one of those colors. It will allow you to get that color picker and choose a different color. I'm happy with the blue. It just means that it's a nice color, and then I can come in with a clean black outline on top of it, and I can really see the difference in between the two. I'm going to start sort of drawing basic things in there and just laying down a rough sketch. My line work is very kind of opaque at the moment, so I'm going to undo that. And what I'm going to kind of look at here is a few options that allow me to use this pen in a very different way than I would normally use a mouse. So a mouse has two states. It's either on or it's off. It's clicked or not clicked, if you will. So this controls the brightness of that light, of that intensity. So what happens on screen is essentially this. I'm going to go up to my brush tool, which is this little paintbrush icon in here. And I'm going to go to this little folder with the brush on it, and it's going to bring up my brush settings, which I can drag out and pop over here. Because I've got a setting here on the size of the actual brush is being controlled by how hard I press down with the pen. That is going to give me a little bit of extra pressure. So if I don't press down very hard, I get a thin line, and if I progressively press down a bit harder, it gets a bit thick again. But I also want to play with how dark, how much kind of paint it puts onto the canvas depending on how much pressure I apply to the brush. So I can do that by going to my transfer option and making sure that my opacity jitter is set to, again, my pen pressure. And you can see in my preview here what it's done is I've got that tapered edge, and I've got also a kind of a gradient on both sides. How that translates on screen is if I'm not pressing down very hard, I get a thin and light line. If I press down a bit harder, I get a darker, thicker line. So this is, again, going to allow me to do a much more kind of sketchy looking sketch digital, because it's all about trying to look a little bit more analog even though it's digital. This is kind of the part of the fun of it. So again, now you can start to see that that's looking a lot more like a pencil sketch. And this is one of the beauties of working with a tool like this, is it allows you for way more control and customization options than if you were simply just using a mouse. So I would say trying to avoid using a mouse to paint with. It's not impossible, it's just not super user-friendly. So I've now got my sketch looking all good. What I need to do now is clean that up. So cleaning up that sketch is going to mean that I'm going to make a new layer, because I don't want to work on that exact same drawing there, because that's just not very friendly for me to edit later on. So I'm going to create a new layer by clicking on this little panel down there. In my layers panel, I've got this button, creates a new layer. You can see here immediately what it's done is it's called it layer 19, and it's created a new layer. I'm probably going to work with anywhere in between 20 to maybe 100, maybe even 200 layers, depending on your process and how detailed the piece is. You're going to want to start naming those layers. It's just good practice. So I'm going to double click on where it says layer 19, and I'm just going to call this something that makes sense for me, outlines. So I've got my sketch now, I've got my layer ready to go. I'm going to draw on that layer. I want to turn my opacity variant off on the pen pressure, because I want a nice, clean, even colored line throughout. But I do want the tapered edges, so I'm just going to leave that in there for now. And I'm going to go back to my color and select my black. And now I'm ready to go. So I'm going to start painting those lines in. And you can see on my screen that it's just not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a really smooth, clean, kind of soft line. And what's going to help me out in Photoshop here is I'm going to turn on my smoothing. So at the moment up here in my brush, you can see that I've got smoothing, and that's at 11%. I'm going to boost that up to like anywhere in between 60 to 70%, depending on what I'm doing. What you'll notice if you do that is that it may slow your stroke down a little bit. It might just kind of lag a little bit. It's not really lag, it's smoothing your line down as you go, and so it's doing a little bit of extra work. But what it will do is it'll make it a lot harder for you to get that kind of jittery line, and you'll get something that's a lot smoother and a lot cleaner to work with and just feels really nice with that particular nib that I'm working, which offers a little bit of resistance. It's a little bit like drawing in butter, which is like dream for me because it becomes these really smooth buttery lines. It's just a little bit of resistance and that really kind of cool smoothness that you can get along with the size of the screen, which allows me to use more of my arm. It's not just my wrist. You get these really nice kind of smooth flowing lines that are really nice to work with. I think this is something that's really important for you guys kind of starting out to keep in mind, is that there's no really right or wrong way of doing things when you're working with Adobe programs. There's usually more than one way to do the exact same thing. Some of them might be faster, some of them might be easier, but really the thing that you're looking for here is which one is most enjoyable to you? Which one do you like to work with the best? All right, so we've got our outline all looking good now. This is the one that I prepared earlier. And we're now kind of seeing a nice, super clean, super sharp outline that we've worked with. And one of the reasons I like to work with this outline is I like to get a bit of thickness because it gives me a little bit of margin for error. I'm going to add a layer here. I'm going to pick a different color, so like kind of like a dark blue. I'm going to start sort of painting in. I can turn the smoothing down a little bit here because I'm really just going to be filling in areas quite roughly, so it doesn't need to be super smooth. But what you'll see is the advantage of the nice kind of thick outline is it just gives me a little bit of a buffer area where I don't need to be super clean, and it doesn't matter what's happening on the inside of the line because that's just going to be filled anyways, right? So then I've got something that's a lot more easy for me to use, and I can get some nice kind of clean shapes in. Now you can see there's a few areas here where the line has gone out of the stroke or I haven't been careful enough. I can always erase those and clean that up. So I'm going to undo all of the painting that I just did, and I'm actually going to go a faster way. I'm going to use kind of like a paint bucket tool, but I'm going to use selections to paint rather than have to fill in the whole thing, and I might miss little spots here and there. It might not be super clean. Let me close this panel. And my selection tools are up here in Photoshop. So I've got a rectangle selection tool and a lasso tool. So both of those are going to work in different ways. The rectangle tool, if I hold down, you'll see there's a little kind of chevron in the bottom right-hand corner of it. That tells me that there's more options in that tool. So if I click and hold, I'll pop up a few more different options like, so the rectangular one just makes, no surprises, rectangles. If I'm holding down Shift as I do that, I'm going to make a perfect square selection, right? So if I let go of Shift, you'll notice that it starts to kind of get a bit more freehand. If I hold down Shift again, it constrains it to a perfect square. So then you'll see these little kind of dotted lines. This is what we call the marching ants. They signify that there's a selection that has been made of those particular pixels. And nothing that I do can happen outside of that selection. So if I come in with my brush now and paint inside here, you'll notice that that's fine. But as soon as I go outside of that selection, it doesn't do anything because it's saying, no, you selected these pixels, I'm only going to do stuff to those pixels, not anywhere else on the page. We've also got lasso tool, which is the one that we're going to use. There's a bunch of different ones. We're only going to go with the regular one. And what that's going to allow me to do is literally just draw a selection. So you can see on my line work here, I'm doing that, and then I let go, the marching ants pop up again, and I can draw in that selection. There we go. We've got that. I don't want that selection anymore, so Control D for deselect. And I can now go to my lasso tool, which is L on my keyboard. And I'm going to go into my outline here, making sure that I'm on my main fill layer. And what you can see here is, again, I can get real squiggly within those lines, and it doesn't really matter. I've got room to kind of make mistakes here within that outline. So I'm going to go and make a quick selection of all of this shape. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add to this selection. So if I hold down Shift with that tool selected, you'll notice that a little kind of plus sign comes up next to the tooltip. And that's going to allow me to add areas to that selection. If, however, I hold down Alt on my keyboard, different things are going to happen where I'm going to get the minus sign, and that's going to allow me to take things out of my selection. So in this case, I want to add to it, so I'm going to hold down Shift and continue my selection. I don't need to hold down Shift anymore, I only need to do it at the start. And I'm going to fill out that whole area of my flower petal. And now I've got all that good to go. This is where your keyboard shortcuts are going to come in handy. We've spoken a little bit about those keyboard shortcuts up to this stage, pressing B for brush, E for eraser, L for the lasso tool, Command D, all those kind of things. Keyboard shortcuts are really good because they just save time. Again, it's all about maximizing your workflow. It's all about sort of making sure that you're comfortable and you don't have to step out of your groove while you're in it and do other things. And going over to the menu, as you guys will see, going to Edit, you'll have a little keyboard input. That tells you what the shortcut for that is. So first time you go to that menu, look at what the command shortcut is for that and memorize it, and you'll use it all the time. Alt, backspace fills with your foreground. If I switch to a different background color, you'll see what happens if I do Control backspace. It will fill with my background color. So at this stage, we've got our outline, we've got a main fill, and we're ready to move forward with our piece here. The first thing that I'm going to do here to add a little bit more contrast, a little bit more kind of pop to this image, if you will, is using shading. So lighting and shading is really, really handy to take something that's essentially flat on a screen and give it the illusion that it's in volume in 3D. First thing I need to do is make a duplicate of that layer. So with that layer selected, I've hit Control J, and you can see in my layer panel here what it's done is it's taken that layer which I called main fill, because that's exactly what it is, and now I've got main fill copy. So we're going to call this one shading. All right? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to edit the colors of this. So again, editing colors is one of Photoshop's core features. And in this case, I want to make it a bit darker. So I could go up into my menus here and start sort of delving into those and go to adjustments and go to hue saturation. But as again, we've mentioned, you'll notice right next to that is a little Control plus U. That's telling me the keyboard shortcut for it. So I'm going to hit Control U, and I get this slider that comes up. And what this does is it allows me to change the color of that entire layer. I don't need to make a selection here because it's already on a separate layer. So I'm kind of, darker than my color, which is already pretty dark. So I'm going to basically just go with a black. Now I've got that on top of my other layer. I'm going to work with layer masks. So layer masks are one of the core features of Photoshop as well. They go hand in hand with layers. And what I'm going to do here is on my panel, in my layers, I'm going to click on this little kind of white rectangle with a black circle in it. And that's going to add a little square next to it that's kind of got this little chain link added to it. And that's going to mean that I've got a layer mask with nothing on it at this stage. As soon as I click on my layer mask, it goes to black and white, because black and white are the only two colors that you can use with a layer mask, because black will mask things and white will reveal the thing. So white is the hole in your black canvas, if you will. I'm now going to paint directly onto this. I've got a white layer mask here, which is revealing the entire layer. I don't want that, I want to hide it, so I'm going to come in with the black and paint. What I can then do is if I've made a mistake like that, for instance, if I've kind of cut into an area a little bit too fast, or I've made a mistake and then, that's not really what I want to do. So all I need to do now is switch colors. I just need to switch back to the white, and that will start sort of revealing that mask again. And how I do that is basically just hit X on your keyboard. X switches between your foreground and background color. And then I can paint that back in, and I'm just kind of like patching up holes or creating new ones as I go. So that's a kind of a quick look at layer masks. This is usually how I would do my shading. This is the final piece as it stands with all the shading. You can see I've got my layer mask and it's revealing all of that. All right, so now I've got a good amount of volume in there, and it's really starting to kind of come together and pop. What we've got is a good base of a drawing. We've got the shading, we've got the outline, everything's kind of working well. I'm going to start adding details to this. I'm going to do this in the most straightforward way possible, and I'm going to kind of jump ahead and show you guys how this is going to work here on screen. Is all these gradients here are starting to make it look like there's a bit of a glow. Again, the illustration I'm going for here is this kind of like, cyberpunk, futuristic neon kind of Japanese peony. And I want these colors to be really bright and neon-y. And I want them to go in specific areas. So all I need to do here is create a new layer. I'm going to call this petal gradients because I'm going to put gradients on those petals. Now what I can do is I can go to my gradient tool. So my gradient tool by default looks like this, right? So it's a gradient that's going to go from a foreground color to a background color in a nice kind of smooth line, depending on the options that I kind of plug into it. So this is what happens if I do it. So I'm going to click, drag, and this is what happens, right? You get this kind of nice, smooth gradient. If I don't drag very far, I get a much sharper gradient because it does the gradient over less distance. If I do it across the entire canvas, it's going to be a lot smoother and a lot softer. But it's also applying to the entire canvas. I don't want that. I want it to apply to specific areas. So again, I'm going to have to go to my selection tool and make a selection within that. That's going to be underneath my outline layer, but on top of my main kind of fill layer, right? And I'm going to create my gradient now. So same thing, click and drag, and it's only applying to that selection. But it's also going outside of that leaf, and I don't want that. What I want is for a color to go from the inside of the flower to the outside, and then it reveals the petal of that flower. So undo that. I'm going to go and select a different color here. Let's say I'm going to go with this kind of like nice hot pink. And I'm going to go into my options here on my gradients and select the second one over on the right, which is a foreground to transparency, so to like no color essentially. And that is going to look like this. That's exactly what I want, right? I want a color that goes from a color to just nothing, completely transparent, and it's only going to apply in my... So I can Command D, deselect that, and then I can make a new one in here, make a kind of a rough selection, and then I can just kind of proceed again, making selections, making gradients, until I'm happy with what I'm looking at, which is going to be something like this. I've added in another gradient in here. As you can see, the center of that is kind of glowing a little bit blue as well. It just adds to this feeling of kind of light happening. What I'd like to do at this stage as well is change the background color from a white to a black. So I'm going to go into my colors, choose a black, Alt, backspace, and that's going to fill. The reason why I do this is because I work with a lot of kind of bright neon-y colors. So now I can start to kind of play around with details here and add in some kind of different structures. On a separate layer, I've done the outlines of these little kind of sprouts that come out of my peony. So they're all on a separate layer because then I can control the color. I can also tell them to go in front and behind different things. It just becomes a little bit smoother to use. My process is really only sort of 4 or 5 steps, just combined in different ways. So again, with this one, I've created a gradient. I've made a selection of the thing. I'm using a layer mask. It's all kind of different ways of doing that, but that's how I got that kind of glow on the stem of those sprouts. Okay, so let's add in some detail here. And I've made these two kind of different layers here with the circuit boards. I'll add in a little bit of a ball in the middle and all these kind of details, like it's got a bit of a hole in it. But what I'll now do is I'll show you guys a cool little trick that I use to kind of create these guys. So these little pixels that are like pollen coming out of that flower, they all look like they're glowing. There's a really easy, cool way to do this in Photoshop, and that is with what we call layer styles. So layers all have kind of properties, and what I'm going to show you guys here is I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to call this pixels. I'm going to go to my rectangular marquee tool, which is my selection tool here, and I'm going to hold down Shift and click and drag, and I'm going to make a perfect square. Then I'm going to go to my green color that I had selected before, and I'm going to hit my old shortcut, which is Alt backspace, and that's going to fill that with the green, and then Control D will deselect that. So then now I've got that. I'm going to double click on that, and it's going to bring up this panel here, which is my layer style. The main one that I'm looking at here is outer glow, and that's going to do something like this. I can tell it to kind of go a little bit more glowy, a little bit bigger, a little bit brighter. So I'm going to go for something like this. So now I need to resize this. So I'm going to hit Control T, and that's going to bring up this kind of bounding box, right? And what I want to do is I want to make it a bit smaller. And it'll also allow me to move things around. So I can click on it and just drag it with my pen down to there, And when I'm happy with the scale of it, I just hit enter, and that applies that specific change to it. But I want to make a few more of these because what I'm looking for is something that's going to be like this, where they're all scattered around. So now all I need to do is, because I've applied all of those effects to that layer, all I need to do is make copies of that layer. So Control J is going to duplicate that layer. Control T is going to allow me to move it and rescale it. But again, I can just do this a whole bunch of times over and over again until I'm happy with the amount of pixels that I've gotten. And that's kind of the main illustration finished here. I want to add kind of something that holds that illustration all together. So I'm going to make a, let's say like a triangle in the background just to kind of hold that in there. So I'm going to go to my polygon tool here, which is this guy down here. I'm going to click and hold on that, and I'm going to go back to the little hexagon one, which is my polygon tool. And now I need to create a new layer, and I'm going to double click anywhere on the screen, it doesn't really matter. And what happens here is I can create a polygon of a certain size with a bunch of different sides. So I'm after 3, and I'm going to hit OK. And that's now created a nice, clean, almost perfect triangle for me to work with. So Command T, I'm going to rescale this a little bit to make it a bit bigger. And I'm going to rotate this. So I want to rotate it exactly at a 90-degree angle because I want it to be kind of pointing down. So I'm going to, still in my Control T option here, I'm going to go to the corner there where I get this kind of like sideways arrow. And I'm going to hold down Shift, and that's going to allow it to snap to various angles. And whenever it hits there, you'll notice in the bottom there, it's got 90 degrees. That's all good. And I'm happy with that. And I'm going to hit Return. So that's my triangle now all good to go. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger still. But it's at the top. And I don't want it to be at the top. I want that to be at the bottom. So all I want is for that to be behind my main flower because that's what it's going to do. Now, I want to add a stroke to that because what I'm after is actually something like this, where there's these two triangles. So I'm going to click and hold down that, basically just a right click with my pen. And I'm going to go to where it says Rasterize Layer. And now what I can do is I can double click on that layer again, bring up that same panel that I used when I was creating that kind of glow around the pixels. But instead of going to the outer glow, I'm going to go to Stroke. And what you guys can see is immediately it's kind of created a stroke around that, so it's just an outline. I can control how big or small that is, and I control the color of that stroke as well. So I want it kind of like a pink outline or like a blue outline maybe. That's better, and that's all good to go. I've also got that green fill in there, which I don't want. I just want the stroke around that to be the case. I'm going to fill this shape with white. I'm going to play with what's called blending modes. First thing I need to do is with my layer selected, I need to go and click on this little kind of checkerboard that's in my layer panel. And that's going to lock the transparency. So any pixels that are see-through are not going to be affected by the change that I'm about to do. Then I go to my color panel and I'm going to choose white. Alt backspace is going to fill that with white. And now I'm going to go to where it says normal. Those are my blending mode lists, and I want to put it on multiply. So multiply is going to take anything that's white and make it see-through. And that's basically everything that I need to do. So I've taken it a bit further, as you guys can see, and made a couple of triangles. One of them has a fill. But what I've also done is I've brought in this scale, like fish scale, Japanese fish scale pattern that goes into the other triangle. And you'll notice that there's a layer mask on that right there. That is an asset that I created in Adobe Illustrator beforehand. I brought it into Photoshop, and I brought it into that image, placed it onto my original artwork, set that again to multiply, so blending modes, multiply. I want to flip that because it's upside down at the moment. So again, rotate that and hit return, and we've got that kind of nice clean thing. So now it's kind of ready to go online. So I can start thinking about how I'm going to save this. So if I'm working with a designer, I would save this as a PSD. So we've got Control-Shift-S, and that brings up this menu, and that allows me to save it as a Photoshop file, as a bitmap, as an EPS, as JPEG. You don't need to know all of them. The two main ones that you'll need to worry about is Photoshop, if you're keen to preserve all the layers and editable capabilities of it, or JPEG. If it's going to be for a screen, JPEG is going to flatten it, so you will have no more of your layers. It'll be exactly like an image that you would find online. If you're going to save it as a JPEG, save it as a copy. And that's, again, Control-Shift-S allows you to save a copy of that file. So you've still got your Photoshop file, and then you've got a JPEG that's ready to go. Generally, if you're saving it for a screen, it's RGB. If you're saving it for a printer, it's going to be CMYK. That's essentially everything. So just to kind of recap what we've done here today is we've looked at kind of taking a sketch that's been done digitally, adding nice clean outlines to it, adding a fill, getting it to kind of have color, adding some shading for volume, and then a whole bunch of different tips and tricks in the layers and their effects to add in details and really make your image kind of pop out of the page using various kind of tools and tips and tricks. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you guys kind of learned something out of this, and good luck with all your Photoshop endeavors, and thanks for watching.